But first, thanks so much, Liliana, and also Alexander, and the scientific committee, and all the committees of committees, for organizing this conference. I mean, you know, this is an amazing conference. It's as I was just saying about, you know, kind of what I guess will be a sort of virtual discussion with Keller, but just generally to engage. We don't have conferences like this at Columbia very often. We have other kinds of things, but so it's always fun and kind of interesting to kind of go away to talk a little bit. I hope, by the way, if you actually I didn't know you were translating something, but I hope you did correct it, because there are a lot of things that could be corrected, probably about what I'm going to say even now. But I'm going to first try to escape and put up a different picture. Yeah, I should do it. Sorry, this is the boring. I don't know. I guess, can you see things? No. Anyway, I'm going to try to, in a sense, continue the conversation. So let's see how we do, and I'll tell you a couple of stories as we go. So to begin with, it's almost the reverse of the zooms that Keller was showing. And just to remind us that Earth, after all, is a locus, a locale. So what we call global is actually itself a locale. On August 25th, 2012, or somewhere thereabouts, the Voyager 1 space probe left our solar system. Maybe you read about this, I don't know. This is a very American thing, sorry. We know this because on that earthly day, because of course they don't have August at the edge of the solar system, the density of ionized plasma particles that the probe encountered while hurtling through space decreased sharply, indicating that it had crossed the horizon created by the sun's magnetic field. That horizon forms what astrophysicists call the heliosphere, a plasma bubble within which our solar system is enclosed. Its radius is approximately 122 astronomical units, you may know, or AUs they're called. 1 AU is approximately 150 million kilometers in length, the average distance separating Earth from the Sun, which means that the radius of the heliosphere and hence of the solar system is roughly 18.2 billion kilometers. So it's big. Okay, anyway. So Voyager 1 was launched, so we're going to get to the Utopia Realism part, I promise. Maybe you can sense where I'm going. Voyager 1 was launched by the American Space Agency, NASA, in 1977. So a long time ago, actually. Back when the Italians were debating about, you know, kind of realism and stuff, they were launching this. So its primary mission had been to explore Jupiter and Saturn. In late 1980, so the year of the Strada Novissima, okay, architecture being postmodernism, after passing closely by Saturn's largest moon, Titan, which is of particular scientific interest due to the atmospheric properties it is thought to share with the primeval Earth, the probe began its journey out of the solar system. As it did so, it continued to record observational data, the quantity of which was limited by the capacity of the probe's 1970, this is the beautiful kind of historicity, the 1970 style 8-track tape storage banks that are on this thing. So this thing has an 8-track tape storage recorder that is still sending back messages. So nevertheless, despite the 8-track tapes, NASA was able to extract sufficient data from the now obsolete machine to confirm recently with relative certainty its historic crossing, a crossing of this horizon, which will likely be repeated in a few more years by its companion probe, Voyager 2. So along with the data comes a certain melancholy. Unlike the ongoing exploration of Mars by NASA's Curiosity rover, or indeed, you know, maybe you've seen some of the pictures, or indeed Voyager 1's earlier encounter with Titan, both of which test the possibility of extraterrestrial life or future human habitation, passage beyond the heliosphere, kind of leaving the solar system, suggests little more than profound interstellar loneliness. The echoes of anthropocentrism, audible in the references to earthly scale, such as, for example, the Earth-to-Sun matrix is the basis for the kind of a giant version of the foot or the meter, like, in other words, a kind of anthropocentric measure. Earth-to-Sun becomes the way we measure the edge of the solar system. These things kind of vanish, like the diminishing signals from the probe's transmitter. Any remaining reference to human experience, including, by the way, the human lifespan or even humanity's recorded history, is effectively canceled by the realization that Voyager 1 will not encounter another star or another solar system for another 40,000 years or so. So it's going to take a while to re-enter history. But my purpose in beginning with this story is twofold. First, it's to remind you of the persistence of what the late 20th century called the measure of man. We did hear a bit about this earlier, or the habit of describing space, even interplanetary space, in terms relative to perceptible human scale and human experience. Second, it's to introduce the problem of the horizon in a manner that correlates that scale, a kind of anthropocentrism, with a certain kind of thought, and in the process to explain what the terms utopia and realism could mean. So as alluded, as Liliana just mentioned, and also as she alluded to in the conference program, some years ago, I published this short article in Harvard Design Magazine called "Critical of What," for which I'm still paying the price. Subtitle "Tour to Utopian Realism." The article was really a very specific. It was a kind of intervention in a particular situation. It commented on the design competition for the reconstruction of New York's Ground Zero. Oops. There, sorry, that's in the wrong order. In the aftermath of the 9/11 terrorist attacks. I still remember some meetings, Keller, right? Right around that time. What are we going to do? Anyway, this is one of my responses was this. My most immediate target was the anti-intellectual, post-political discourse that sometimes went under the rubric of the post-critical, which I argued then and will argue now, framed a certain of the proposed designs. I'm not going to show them to you. I further argued that thus framed, certain of the pseudo-utopian designs, because there was a lot of this fantasy land going on there, designs for Ground Zero, particularly the designs submitted by the group that called itself Without Embarrassment. Apparently some of them are coming here in the near future. The United Architects. Don't forget, United Nations, United States, United Architects. The elision was deliberate, and it was brutal, and still is. It still makes me sort of, well, I guess angry. This constituted an architectural manifestation of the triumphalism then saturating politics and culture in the United States and in much of the West. This hasn't gone away. My larger target, however, was, and in many ways remains, the neo-imperialist triumphalism itself, as expressed in the marriage between anti-intellectual and post-political ideologies, which remains a central element in the unholy alliance between neoliberal capitalism and the will to power. So anyway, okay. So the argument was simply that in complying for the demand for visionary proposals for Ground Zero, this demand was made in the public sphere, like the New York Times, for example, was demanding vision, as was the government, as was everybody. There must be vision. In complying with this demand, architects were operating in the service of an emboldened sense of empire and war on all fronts and not against it. Quoting myself. The pseudo-theoretical language of the post-critical was nothing more than an alibi for doing this. Of course, in the end, none of the designs from that competition were ever built. They became redundant, nor did the post-critical theoretical stance ever really develop into much. It became a little kind of flash in the pan. That is because, as I just said, both turned out to be redundant to the needs of the system themselves. They were no longer necessary. They merely prepared the ground for more blatant mixtures of politics and theology. But at that moment, something like a visionary architecture, unbound from self-critique, was a necessary ingredient to stir the public imagination focused on ground zero. Moreover, far from simply commemorating the lives lost, that site had become what I called then an aesthetic training ground for the militarization of everyday life. Not because it put tanks in the streets of New York. That was reserved for Kabul and Baghdad, along with neo-colonial reterritorialization that followed. No, not because there were tanks in the street of New York, but because it put architecture there. Architecture was necessary. It was a necessary, in a sense, form of cultural training that corresponded with the militarization of consciousness at that time. Anyway, given such a situation and the impasse that it seemed to represent, I felt compelled, and I still do, I must say, to ask the perennial question, what is to be done? And in that time, the response was kind of vague. It was deliberately vague, utopian realism, okay, whatever. But by that, I did not and do not mean to propose either a return to classical utopianism or a realist accommodation of the status quo. Nor do I mean anything like the familiar sounding, and it does sound familiar, anti-deconstructionist new realism that's advocated by Maurizio Ferraris and his colleagues, at least as far as I've been able to gather. That's also mentioned in the conference program as they explained it in their recent manifesto. Nor by utopia and utopian do I mean anything like an ideal city or a mystical desire for a perfect world. I simply mean the performative, and it's important that it's understood as performative in action. It's a thought that's also in action. The thought that things could be different, that history didn't have to turn out this way, and that what is not the same as what ought to be. And by realism, I mean precisely that what is, it's almost a counterintuitive notion of realism, that what is commonly given as real, and taken as the non-negotiable ground on which politics is founded, the real, is in fact subject to change. Realism then does not mean deferral to so-called reality, a kind of pragmatism or recognition, of the limits. Whether that reality is defined as capitalism and its markets, or as imperial power and its needs and desires, and so on and so on. Realism is the historical recognition that all of these are subject to change, that in fact they do change, and that in fact, as Marx recognized some time ago, their own internal dynamics require them to change. So utopian realism, in the sense that at least I intended it at that time, is therefore not only the thought that things could change, or even that they must change, it is that they must be made to change differently. Because this was change. I mean, this was all kinds of change and still is. So it must be made to change differently. In saying this, it's important to acknowledge, of course, the will to power that is present in all utopian thought, however egalitarian, democratic, or agonistic its aims may be. There is some arrogance in asserting that things must change. And I think, the sort of righteous arrogance that Keller is referring to is very much there. And that they must do so in this or that manner, a kind of willfulness. Right? But I think there's also an assumption of responsibility, a response, literally a response to the situation, an assumption of responsibility in asserting that things must change. Utopia, in that sense, is a historically delimited, situated thought, and not some ideal, immaterial, or universal dream. As such, it is subject to the tangible, material constraints that constitute what we call reality. It is not an escape from those, it's a function of those constraints, of material constraints. Only certain thoughts are possible under certain historical conditions and certain arrangements of power, including the thought that things must change, and the specific way of imagining and enacting such change. So these very real concrete horizons, the horizons of imagining change, which delimit the kinds of transformation that are and are not thinkable in a given situation and at a given moment, are drawn and redrawn by the seemingly abstract thought called utopia. So to return to the architectural debates, and this is part one of this talk is on the architectural subject, and then I'm going to take you very far away. This is really part 1.5 because we started with the satellites, or the probe. Anyway, to return to the architectural debates then, in assessing the cultural politics surrounding the redesign of Ground Zero, it is important. I mean, to the extent, I think we really haven't even, certainly in New York, and I think to the extent that this matters anywhere else in the world, the discussion has been foreclosed. But anyway, in opening this up, it's important to remember the historical conditions in which these were cast. The anger and wounds of 9/11 removed from their historical and political context, basically decontextualized, and the near total American triumphalism in righteous support of military action. Combined with the parochial debates in architecture regarding the alleged futility of critique and hence of dissent, these conditions effectively foreclose the possibility of a genuinely critical, not to say utopian, response to the situation. Or to put it another way, the ritual incantations in architecture, as in culture at large, proclaiming the need for a new realism, seemed finally to have exorcised or expelled what we can call utopia's ghost. And by this I mean that they've expelled or neutralized the specter or the virtual possibility of systemic historical change. A specter is haunting Europe and so on. However, somewhat counterintuitively, and this is in a sense the ruse of history that's going on. Somewhat counterintuitively, in the aftermath of 9/11, the most common form this exorcism took, was actually the pseudo-utopian statement that everything has changed. So it wasn't that we must return to some reality, the claim that everything already has changed was the authorizing statement that, of course, enabled all kinds of other violence. This statement was repeated innumerable times from positions of political power as well as in the mainstream Western and international media. Everything has changed post 9/11. Like many other demagogic speech acts, it had the practical effect of, in a sense, changing everything. We knew then, and we know now, that it is not true. In fact, 9/11 changed very little. However, backed up by power and by an open-ended state of emergency, the false statement that everything had changed not only authorized previously unthinkable military action and imperial conquest, it effectively blocked organized dissent. The statement therefore helped to realize the anti-critical dreams of global cultural representatives, including, I must say, many architects and architectural theorists who are only too happy to play this game, by both demonstrating and denying that, to borrow a slogan from the alter globalization movements, another world is possible, since another world seemed already to have arrived. Everything has changed. Another world seemed already to have arrived too soon and preemptively, to preempt, as it were, actual change. Now, of course, what happened in America is not what happened elsewhere. We are familiar with the many and diverse forms taken by dissent and by alternatives to the New World Order that had been enacted in the global streets. But before returning to the story with which I began, I just want to conclude these sort of introductory comments on architectural debates, repeating the question, what is to be done? Unsatisfied, I must say, by the vagueness of the term utopian realism, and somewhat dismayed to discover, I must also admit, that it had actually been used earlier in a different, contrary sense by the British third-way sociologist Anthony Giddens, basically to apologize for third-way politics. I wanted to pose this question again in Utopia's Ghost, though this time not in the aftermath of 9/11, but of architectural postmodernism. And so here we're in dialogue with a number of the papers earlier on the various aspects of postmodernism. Somewhat uncannily, the violent destruction of Minoru Yamasaki's World Trade Center of 1972, with thousands of lives lost in 9/11, had been preceded by the demolition, also in 1972, of another Yamasaki building, the Pruitt-Igoe housing complex, as I said, just as the same time the World Trade Center was nearing completion. So Yamasaki at it, in a sense, at both ends of his career. The two projects are genealogically connected. Pruitt-Igoe's demolition marks the beginning of the end in the West of the Keynesian welfare state, and the World Trade Center's opening. The World Trade Center's opening marks the consolidation, assisted by the same state, of neoliberal capital under what has come to be called globalization. So it's often that the year 72-73 is used to mark the transition, full transition globally to neoliberalism. Anyway, this backdrop suggests at least one straightforward answer to the what is to be done question. Very simply, reopen the housing question. Everywhere, worldwide, globally. If public or social housing, which was the real target of many postmodernist critiques of the modern city, if this materialized architecturally the contradictions of the social democratic or socialist state, and if its demolition or privatization is representative of an across-the-board neoliberal turn, it nevertheless marks a line, or a kind of internal horizon, a line internal to the post-war city. Crossing that line by leaving nothing exempt from privatization seems definitively to have answered the housing question in favor of predatory capital, at the expense of those whose lives are made most precarious in the post-industrial city. Reopening that question, beginning with Friedrich Engels' famous text on the subject in 1872, which is, by the way, all about rural to urban migration, does not mean opposing the near absolute sovereignty of markets with the insidious authority of the state apparatus. So this is not to, in some nostalgic way, to back in the good old days of the socialist state. It does, however, mean learning to live in the North and West as well as in the East and South with the material, institutional, and symbolic ruins of the socialist project in its many forms. And I say that quite knowingly in this city. With the material, institutional, and symbolic ruins of the socialist project in its many forms, learning to live with these ruins, and with the specters of utopia that still haunt those ruins. It does not mean reconstructing those ruins as they were, or bringing their ghosts back to life. But it does mean staging within them an unexpected return, as ghosts tend to do. That's what ghosts do, they come back. Okay. The time is out of joint, was Jacques Derrida's way of anachronistically citing Shakespeare to conjure what he called the specters of Marx after the fall of the Berlin Wall. And so, rather than continue down the path that I've just laid out and kind of continue to tell the story through architectural history and theory, I want abruptly to return to where I began in an effort to conjure another time entirely.